If you need more time, I'm afraid I can't help you. I'd like to thank Bob Rosencrantz and Intelligence Squared. I feel like I've spent most of the past year watching presidential debates. It's nice to finally be in one. Please don't change your minds. Bush was obviously the worst president of the past 50 years. Yet the task Simon and I have tonight is extremely difficult. We have to convince a small fraction of you, at least if you're anything like the people who have given Bush the lowest approval rating of any post-war president, who still resist that conclusion. And to be honest, I'm not sure that people who still defend the Bush presidency are entirely open to persuasion. But I want to try by talking a little bit about how much Bush has done wrong and how little he's done right. Let me first just tell you a little bit about my own perspective on this. I am not a Bush hater. I'm not someone who can be described as a partisan Democrat the way Mr. Kristol and Mr. Rove are partisan Republicans. I'm a centrist liberal. I'm fairly hawkish on security issues. I'm in favor of limited government. And let me just state up front, I think George W. Bush was a fine governor of Texas. I think Ronald Reagan was a successful president. And I think George H.W. Bush, 41, understood foreign policy better than all but a few presidents in the post-war era. About 2 years ago, I started writing a book about the Bush presidency. And I was going to spend a lot of time on Bush's successes and accomplishments. And I'll admit that I wanted to do that not just to be fair, but so I would look fair. And I looked for those successes and accomplishments, and I looked, and I looked, and I came back totally empty-handed. There were a number of areas where I expected to stick up for Bush, but I really found it impossible. For example, I was sympathetic to his approach to education reform. But even from a conservative perspective, Bush didn't provide enough resources to allow for any real mobility or choice in public schools. Instead of national standards, which we needed, he let the states write their own tests. That's what the conservative base wanted. They don't believe the federal government should be involved in education at all. And in caving into them, Bush ensured that he'd make little meaningful progress on education. And in fact, he has made very little meaningful progress. I thought Bush was right about the need for immigration reform. And then I watched him surrender to the xenophobes and nativists in his own party. I thought Bush was right to spend a lot of money fighting AIDS in Africa. And then I watched him save far fewer lives than he might have because of religious extremists, again in his own party, who believe abstinence propaganda is more effective than condoms. I thought Bush was right about free trade. And then I watched his lack of leadership lead to the collapse of the most important item on the global trade agenda, the Doha development route. So those are the partial successes. And I can't hope to cover all Bush's failures tonight. What would be a top failure for another president doesn't even really make his top five. So never mind his incompetent response to Hurricane Katrina. It doesn't make the cut. Never mind his denial of climate change and 8 lost years on global warming. That doesn't make the cut either. I'm just going to give you my top 5. Number 1 is the invasion of Iraq. This was the most important decision of the Bush presidency, and he made it on the basis, as I think we all know, of the false premise that Saddam Hussein was threatening the United States with weapons of mass destruction and consorting with al-Qaeda. Now, I'm not someone who believes that Bush deliberately falsified the evidence, but I believe he was totally uninterested in the evidence. This war would never have been fought if Bush had been interested in the truth as opposed to finding a pretext for something he wanted to do. I think his second biggest failure is the mismanaged occupation of Iraq. Bush refused for more than 3 years to change a failed military strategy. And almost that whole time, people like my friend Mr. Kristol here were desperately insisting, rightly in my view, that Bush needed to move to a counterinsurgency strategy. Bush said, essentially, don't bother me with the details. He delegated the strategy to Rumsfeld and he ignored the failure. I think the surge has helped tremendously in Iraq. The outrage is that Bush moved to it in 2007. Not in 2003 or 2004. His third biggest failure is undermining constitutional rights and American ideals. Now, I can't go into detail here about all the ways he abused his authority and disregarded the rights of both foreigners and American citizens. But he and Vice President Cheney opened the door to torture, which led directly to the horrors of Abu Ghraib. He effectively suspended habeas corpus, holding suspects for years without charge or trial, and he took a perverse view of his office, claiming that virtually limitless executive authority was part of the inherent power of the presidency. His fourth failure was sabotaging American unity after September 11th. The day after the attacks, the front page of Le Monde in Paris said, "We are all Americans." The whole world was with us. But Mr. Bush and Mr. Rove saw September 11th as a political opportunity for what Spiro Agnew called positive polarization. Now, Simon is going to speak to the harm that this did to America's image in the world. But I would just say, with the new administration coming into office, never in more than 200 years of our history has restoring America's standing around the world been such an urgent project for a new president. Number 5, my last, is Bush's catastrophic economic mismanagement. This is so current we hardly even need to spell it out. It remains to be seen whether we're facing a depression, whether Bush will stand in for Herbert Hoover. But I think it's clear that we're living through the direct result of an ideological refusal to sensibly regulate financial markets. Bush says he's sorry about all the lost jobs, if you saw his interview on ABC last night. But as he loses his, the interesting question is whether he ever understood, or understood now, his own contributions. Now, our opponents this evening may try to argue that Richard Nixon or Jimmy Carter was worse, but neither of those presidents failed as badly as Bush. Carter had the Camp David Agreement, and despite Watergate, Nixon left historic accomplishments, including opening relations with China and creating the Environmental Protection Agency. Neither of them rivals Bush for sheer, all-pervading incompetence. But if our opponents tonight... Thank you. I'm closing here. If our opponents tonight wish to argue that Bush was only the second worst president of the last 50 years, that's not much of a defense. This national nightmare, I would suggest, has been the deepest and longest of all.